afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and this session, which has been drawn on the basic inspiration on the basis of which this entire conference and the summit, the deliberation has been put together, Jai Hind. We believe when we say Jai Hind, we are thinking right on the top. But yes, doesn't mean to say that we are not looking at the bottom. The bottom is as much an integral part of as it happens to be on the top. Therefore, to have the top level view of how to make India a $10 trillion economy by 2030, we have put together an esteemed panel of distinguished experts. Let me take this opportunity to introduce Mr. Shaktikanta Das, G20 Sherpa and member of 15th Finance Commission. He will be speaking on multilateralism and India 2030. Given a distinguished career that he had, which lasted as the Economic Affairs Secretary till about February, if I'm not mistaken, he has continued to make the contributions as has been recognized by the Government of India. Let me also introduce Dr. M. Ramachandran. He is former Secretary, Urban Development, and a distinguished fellow with Scotch Development Foundation. He would be speaking on Urban India 2030. Please give him a big round of applause. Unfortunately, Dr. Gulshan has taken ill, so he will not be joining us. Let me now introduce Professor Ashima Goyal from IGIDR and a part-time member of Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister to speak on monetary policy and fiscal framework, the route to India 2030. And she was conferred the Scotch Challenger Award yesterday for her contributions to economic policy. Please join me in giving her a big round of applause. Political economy requisites for a new India is what Lord Meghnad Desai is going to be talking about. He is founder and chairman, Meghnad Desai Academy of Economics, but he, beyond that, doesn't need any introduction. He also has been a Scotch awardee. And the last speaker would be Mr. Pranjal Sharma, who would be speaking on a digital path to India 2030. He has recently authored a famous book, Kranti Nation, and is also member on the advisory board PACI World Economic Forum. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome you all once again, and I have the pleasure of inviting Mr. Shaktikanta Das to talk about multilateralism in India 2030. Sir.
Good morning to all the distinguished panelists on the dais. Good morning to the entire audience, ladies and gentlemen. I'm extremely thankful to Scotch, Mr. Samir Kocher and his colleagues for inviting me to be here. In fact, Scotch has carved out a place for itself for a lot of developmental debate and discussions in the public space on critical development issues. So we must all note the kind of forum they provide for these kind of discussions, and let me begin by complimenting Scotch, Mr. Samir Kocher and all his colleagues for taking this initiative. The second reason why I must also thank Scotch is that they have asked me to speak first in this session. It enables me to sort of complete my part and then be there and listen very carefully with undivided attention to the distinguished panelists of, very distinguished panelists and eminent speakers who are there on the dais. Now, the topic that has been given to me is multilateralism and India 2030. The if you see the way technology has developed in the modern world, it's just a cliche to say that the world is a global village. But the way technology has developed over the last 1 decade, and more particularly over the last 2 or 3 years, and the way world investment climate is taking shape, the way world trade is moving forward, the way artificial intelligence is coming to play an important role in modern economy, in modern world, and the way e-commerce is slowly taking over the entire, is slowly taking over and coming, occupying a major portion of the global trade and local business. It only shows that the world is coming much closer than ever before. So globalization is taking deeper roots and it is here to stay. So it's a bit ironical to see that you have a situation where globalization is taking deeper roots thanks to technology, thanks to modern transportation, thanks to e-commerce and all these other things which I mentioned. While that is happening on one side, the narrative, some of the recent political and economic narrative seems to be pulling in the other direction. You have now countries, advanced countries which advocated free trade all these years are now talking in terms of greater protectionism. You have territorial unions like the European Union, for example, some kind of a territorial union was formed. They went for a monetary union and one market, common market, they tried to develop without, of course, a fiscal union. That is now also facing certain recalcitrant trends, and one eminent member, Great Britain, has decided to, sort of exit the European Union. So some of the very vocal debate and discourse and the recent narrative seems to be pulling in the other direction. So this places, this I think places multilateralism in this context today faces greater challenge. Is multilateralism here going to stay? Or are we going to have more and more bilateral pulls? Are we going to have more and more of nationalistic pulls and pressures? Is policy decision in both developed and developing countries going to be decided more by multilateral pressures or more by bilateral and other kinds of domestic pressures is the issue. I think in this context, we have to deal with the current situation when we talk of multilateralism and India 2030. Now, so far as talking about India 2030 in the context of multilateralism, before going further into it, I would just like to mention that why these different pulls and pressures are coming. Over the last few decades, developing countries have been taking the position that the way multilateralism has developed, we have been saying that it needs to be fair and equitable among countries. So the fact that you have opposite pressures today happening, in a way, it also goes to show that somewhere the arrangement that we had under multilateralism was perhaps, not fair and not practical. It has been more than fair to developed countries and not so fair to the underdeveloped countries. But today, when developed countries are facing the problem of, facing challenges of development, they're facing slow growth, they're also facing the kind of problems which developing countries faced, problems of jobs, unemployment. There, the pressures come from the developed countries that, to raise question mark over multilateralism. Now, the way to move forward, if the world has to develop together, because global growth, which slowed down over the last few years, in the current year is showing some signs of revival. There are some green shoots happening. IMF and all have projected, I think, 3.4, then 3.7% growth in the coming 2 years. So there are some signs of growth taking deeper roots, global growth taking deeper roots. Now, if global growth has to be sustained, then we need greater multilateralism based on fair, equitable and practical principles. We have to move forward with a multilateral arrangement which is perceived to be beneficial to the world community at large. So India's approach in this context has to be and has been to protect, of course, its domestic, to take care of its local interests. Every country has to take care of its domestic interests. At the same time, move forward to have a multilateral arrangement that is fair and equitable. In this context, I would just like to highlight 4 areas of multilateral arrangements that we have, and then I will conclude. I would talk about G20 and the pursuance and the pursuit of the SDG goals, the Sustainable Development 2030 goals. I'll talk of trade, WTO, number 2. Number 3, I'll talk of multilateral institutions like the World Bank, IMF, etc. Number 4, which is often missed out in many discussions on multilateralism, is on FATF, that is the Financial Action Task Force, which is, which looks after anti-money laundering and combating terror financing issues, because in modern world today, that is the biggest challenge. Now, G20, the presidency, as you know, shifts from one country to the other country every year. 2017, we had the German presidency. 2018, we have the Argentinian presidency. The entire discussion in G20 deliberations today is premised upon how to achieve the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals 2030. And recently we had the first meeting of the Sherpas of the G20 countries discussing various development issues. And the focus was on digitalization, on how to reduce the digital divide among nations, how to reduce the digital divide within countries, how to reduce digital divide between certain sections of society which are better placed and certain disadvantaged sections, like in terms of economic strata, or in terms of gender, or in terms of sheer physical capacity. There were discussion on artificial intelligence, on future of jobs, the challenges which artificial intelligence is posing to future of jobs. Today we are in a position, today we have a world where more investment and more productivity does not necessarily lead to more jobs. More investment, greater productivity in manufacturing sector particularly today is almost becoming equivalent to less number of jobs, because your artificial intelligence, automation, process reforms is replacing human labor and human workforce. Any such challenge which the world has faced, whether it is the industrial revolution of the 18th century or when computers came, let us say, into India, there were initial threats and challenges in the job market. But eventually all this technology produces more number of jobs. So is the current situation. So the discussion in G20 today is mainly focused on how to deal with this transition period of next 3 years or next 3 to 5 years, which is a transition period and which is therefore very critical for the job market worldwide, because artificial intelligence, automation, etc. are displacing people from jobs while achieving greater productivity. So you need to retrain people, you need to you need to sort of focus more on skilling. And I'm happy to point out that I think India has taken the right steps in the recent past in terms of greater focus on skill development, greater focus on retraining and reskilling of our workforce. The discussion in G20 also has focused on other aspects of the Sustainable Development Goals in terms of pursuing the climate change agreement, the Paris Agreement, in terms of more investment and accessibility with regard to healthcare facilities, in terms of pursuing the anti-corruption agenda, which has been which has received greater traction among the countries during the German presidency in 2017, and India has taken a very clear position that countries should unite against against anti-corruption. So G20 today is more focused on achieving the SDG goals 2030, and the various members, the 20 member countries which are participants of the G20, are focusing on this. And very happy to note, I'm very happy also to point out that you have the Sherpa of the United Nations, the Sherpa of the European Union, and other multilateral bodies like, for example, the IMF and the World Bank and WTO. All these multilateral organizations also attend these the G20 meetings. So G20 is becoming a forum to take this agenda forward. 20 countries of the world, in terms of their GDP, form almost nearly about 70 to 80%. I'm not able to recollect the figure clearly, but the greater part of the world GDP is represented by these 20 countries. Now, the second area I would just like to touch upon is with regard to WTO and trade. In the context of international trade, in the context of exports and imports, WTO has to play an important role. Now, time and again, questions have been raised, particularly by developed countries, in sort of discussing issues which are entirely meant to be discussed in WTO. The tendency has been seen that it is first, there is an effort to discuss these issues in other forums and then make it a fait accompli and force the WTO to adopt that line. India's position has been very clear and consistent that trade-related issues, the substantive part of trade-related issues, the negotiations on trade must take place in the WTO and not in any other forum. Having said that, of course, you cannot prevent a group of developed countries or some other group of entering into some kind of an arrangement and taking a combined stand in the WTO for the purposes of negotiation and for the purpose of getting the best deal for themselves. And that is how the negotiations go on, and you cannot question that. The point is that trade-related issues need to be discussed in the WTO. We have found again and again, tendency of bringing in trade-related issues in G20, in various other bodies, and try to make them fait accompli and not discuss them in WTO. But as I said, this position has been taken again recently in the trade ministers meeting which was there in the Buenos Aires, and it has been reported in the media also. You must have noticed it. The same thing came up again in G20, and we made our position very clear, and so also many developing countries. The trade-related issues must be discussed in WTO, and let's not try to sort of bring them into G20 and reach an arrangement, because you are only 20 countries and there is still a larger body of nations and countries which are not part of G20, and they must have a voice. So therefore, the centrality of WTO in world trade, in forming an arrangement for world trade, the centrality of WTO has to continue, and I think that is desirable to achieve a fair and equitable multilateral system and an arrangement between the various countries. The third point I would like to mention while talking of multilateralism is the role of institutions like the World Bank, IMF, the New Development Bank, that is the BRICS Bank, and other such institutions. Now, these institutions over the years, other than IMF, which of course does not do any financing, except of course the countries which are under IMF rehabilitation, but organizations like the World Bank in particular, it's leveraging its lending capability over the years is facing, is contracting. It has not increased, it has not increased in tune with the requirements of the borrowing nations. That is mainly because the World Bank is already leveraged sufficiently and it needs to be recapitalized. Additional capital has to be put by various member countries into the World Bank capital, and that is not happening. India has been taking a position, India as also the other developed countries, that the recapitalization of World Bank together with governance of together with reforms in the governance of World Bank has to be taken forward, because the World Bank governance structure was formed at a time when countries like India and so many other developing countries had a much lower GDP and had a much lower share of world trade, and had a lesser impact on the geopolitical scenario of the entire world. Today, with countries like India and various other developed countries like Brazil, Indonesia, showing greater signs of growth and making their presence felt in the global scenario, there is a need for governance reforms in the World Bank to be in tune with the current world situation. So the World Bank needs reforms of governance. It needs to be additionally capitalized. It's because of the World Bank's inability to recapitalize itself that we found other institutions like the New Development Bank or the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, which has been set up in China, and other multilateral bodies taking over. You also have situation where bilateral funding between, let us say, India to various African and Latin American countries, or from, institutions like the JICA of Japan for development projects in India and other countries, they are coming to play a bigger role. So if multilateralism has to, multilateral institutions have to play an important role and play a supportive role for development of all the, for taking up development projects in the developing countries, World Bank needs to be capitalized and it needs governance reforms. The fourth and last point I wanted to mention was the role of FATF. For India, this is very important, and I must say that India has been able to, make its presence felt in the Financial Action Task Force, which has about 35 member countries, and they work together in evaluating the prevailing situation in various countries, the legal arrangements in various countries, the implementation of the legal arrangements in various countries, to see what kind of steps are taken by countries, by governments, in combating money laundering and in combating terror financing. No other country has faced greater challenge and threat from terrorism than India. India had been for several decades talking about this as a global threat. It's only recently when almost all parts of the world, including the developed part of the world, which have faced challenges in terrorism, that there is a greater realization that the world community should work together to, under the aegis of the FATF, to combat financing of terrorism and to combat money laundering. In this regard, India on its own has taken number of steps. I'm not going into the various steps which has been taken in India in this regard. This is all known to all of you, and I don't want to take more time. But I think FATF has a greater role to play. So to conclude, I would like to say that the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals through the mechanism of G20 and other multilateral bodies, the accomplishment of a fair and equitable trade, world trade, through the mechanism of the WTO, the attainment of a situation where multilateral institutions play a greater role in doing development financing in the world, and the role of FATF, particularly the capability of FATF to combat the issues of money laundering and combat financing of terrorism by certain, combating the financing of terrorism from certain countries. I think all this depends on greater focus on multilateralism. If we need a orderly and fair and equitable global ecosystem, then obviously multilateralism has to play an important role, and for India has to play an important role. And I must point out that in various international fora, whether it is the WTO or the G20 or for example the Paris Climate Agreement, UNFCCC, that is the finance, the climate related UN body, everywhere today India is playing a greater role, and multilateralism has to play an important role and will have to be at the center stage of the focus of global policymakers if we have to have a a more fair, equitable global ecosystem. I think I will conclude here. Just I am reminded of what Abraham Lincoln had said, that the best way to predict the future is to create it. So therefore, the focus of the current policymakers world over has to try and create a best future and a better future for the world community. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for making a prescription, which is what is not very different from what the problems that India and the global arena everybody is facing, particularly to do with the terror financing and stuff like that, and the skill development, the digitalization, and we have talking of the digital inclusion, and particularly including not only the communities, but I think it's going to be a seamless border as we move forward. So with this, I invite Dr. M. Ramachandran to talk about Urban India 2030.
Thank you, Gulshan. Shri Samir Kochar, distinguished speakers on the dais, ladies and gentlemen. Let me start by complimenting Shri Samir Kochar and the SKOCH Foundation for its very eventful 20-year journey, 50 conferences. I was just looking at it, but for these conferences and but for the large number of awards which have been given after recognizing the work which is happening all over the country, there would have been something missing in the domain as far as flagging issues is concerned and encouraging good work is concerned. So for that, the effort made and which continues to be made need to be really complimented. I've been asked to speak about Urban India in 2030. It's a little complex task as Sri Das referred to the multilateralism and the agenda which is before the world nations. I could see some of those having an impact as far as our entire urbanization process is concerned. Some of them would become relevant, particularly the SDG agenda and what we have to achieve by 2030. I'm not referring to figures because that's all quite well known to most of you or those who are active in the field of urban. When it comes to urbanization in India, we keep talking about the number of cities and towns and the census figures which we have. We will have one more census data available after the 2021 census to assess where we stand and what is the direction we are taking. I believe the number of cities and towns will continue to go up as far as India is concerned, and probably during this period which is under review or discussion, we may also cross the 50% mark as far as people living in the urban areas are concerned. We normally start our urbanization discussions with the basic infrastructure provision. Luckily, there are two important points which have been underlined by the government. One is relating to water connection for each household and sewage connection for each household. So with the type of emphasis given, I believe that is about to happen in the next couple of years as per scheduled. But the question that would remain is what happens to the new immigrants or those who move into the cities or those who come in search of jobs. I have a little bit of a doubt about great job opportunities being created in our urban areas because, as again Sri Das referred to, it's going to be a paradigm change as far as the job scenario is concerned. How well we are prepared for that? Would people still have to move from the rural areas to the urban areas, or would there be a regime or scheme of things where remaining in the rural areas they would be able to undertake more of the tasks, and this constant need for moving into the cities probably may not become necessary in the next 10-12 years. The GDP share of the urban areas would definitely continue to go up. Similarly, contribution to tax revenue and also to an extent employment generation, the cities will continue to play a major role. Also, with the Housing for All agenda being taken up very actively, I hope by 2022, we may succeed in providing dwelling units to all those who do not have houses. But then the question is, what about those who may still move to cities? What happens to those additional people who would get added to the city residents? What would be the arrangement for that? So what we will have to be careful about is in the next 10-12 years, while we achieve the basic infrastructure targets and also housing for all and the like, what is the provision which we are going to make as far as the new entrants to the cities are concerned? And that's going to be very critical, and that's where the question of urban planning comes in. There are any number of discussions which states that the way we are handling our urban planning, it has not really succeeded in answering the questions as far as cities' problems are concerned. So how best can we change that? What is it that we can think in terms of moderating or modifying as far as the urban planning process is concerned? One of the critical areas I would like to flag is that of providing water to the cities. I think it's going to be a very major issue if you don't take stock of the situation and plan for that, because water availability for the urban areas is not going to be that easy. There would be issues about the origin of water or where the water flows from. The rural areas would naturally lay their claim to the water, and probably only when that requirement is met can more water be made available to the urban areas. About the sources, recharging, there are issues. So will we focus more on rainwater harvesting, reusing the wastewater? These all would become critical in the coming years, and that would make a big difference as far as availability of water is concerned. Similarly, management of waste also is going to be a big issue. We keep talking about the 3 R's, reduce, reuse, recycle. We have to go beyond that. There are some cities which have made a beginning as far as moving in the direction of zero waste is concerned. So one will constantly have to look at whether we are achieving that objective or not, because the more we add waste to our cities, the more the problems are going to be as far as its disposal is concerned. Already there are issues about landfill sites not becoming available. Other issues, rural areas do not want the urban waste to be dumped in those areas. So these would become critical. So willy-nilly, very consciously, we will have to move in the direction of reducing the waste. So what efforts would we make? Who would take the leadership? I've always talked about waste management has to have a proper strategy at the state level, and from there it has to emanate, and the cities have to be able to fall in line. So it's going to be a very big issue as far as the next decade is concerned. How do we manage this? Also, the other question would be, if there is more action required at the city end, are we going to empower our cities? Are we going to bring about a change as far as the city management, city governance is concerned? Something which continues to be an issue, because very many issues which actually need to be addressed at the city level are not really getting addressed, because some have to be taken care of by the state governments. Quite often state governments look up to the central government for programs to support, and that's the regime which we are in. Will we continue with this type of regime, or will we move to a regime where cities would be able to take care of most of their requirements and issues? Will they be able to generate more resources? That's also going to be a critical issue. Probably those days would be gone when the cities could continue to depend on states. So what further arrangements can be thought of? There are any number of discussions which have taken place about empowering cities to generate more resources at the city end. Will that happen? Will cities be in a better position with city credit rating and things like that? Will they be able to generate more resources? Would that become available? And that would take me to a related point of probably we would enter a regime where cities cannot continue to exist the way they are existing now. That is bound by the limitations of what is a notified body. There are instances globally. UK is a typical example where they have started moving in the direction of, or probably they have already taken the initiative to have a regional approach as far as economic activities are concerned. So we will also have to think in terms of two critical issues. One is a sort of regional or a cluster approach as far as addressing the issues of cities are concerned. How do local bodies or city corporations or municipal bodies work together? What is the mechanism which is going to come into existence? We cannot continue to blame the defined limits, and we have to go beyond that. And in that, not only the urban areas, but some of the peripheral areas, the rural areas also would come in. So what would be the mechanism, governance mechanism, which would be in position to address these issues, whereby cities go beyond and become regional entities? And one can also foresee a situation where there will be competition among regions, cities and regions, for attracting investment and generating more economic activity. Globally, that is becoming an increasing trend, and there is substantial competition happening as far as generating or inviting investment is concerned. So how do we address this? Will per capita investment go up? Because that's something which one has been trying to do all these years. How will that happen? How is that to be facilitated? The service level benchmarks, what is the service which cities provide? That would also become very critical, because again, I think with the type of changes which we are witnessing, we may not be able to continue to live in a scenario where we continue to give assurances. It will have to be seen, it will have to be felt by residents of the cities, and if that is not there, it's going to upset the very structure of activities as far as the cities are concerned. Very broadly, if I could list 5-6 issues which I think would become critical in the coming years. First would be the the issue of urban mobility, movement within city. During the Smart Cities mission, one has already noticed that one thought that basic issues like drinking water becoming available or waste being treated would be critical for people. But when people were asked to participate in the process of giving shape to the Smart Cities mission, there are many cities which have flagged the issue of city transport, urban mobility. People do not want to waste time today. It's not only wasting time, it's the congestion issues, the related pollution issues, and all those aspects. Since public transport has not been able to take its rightful place in our cities, how are we going to address this critical issue? There has been talk about having a unified metropolitan transport authority for big cities. It has not really come into existence in our country, in the big cities at least to start with. So who takes care of the problems of mobility within the city, analyzing and giving solutions? There is no body, and unfortunately transport is not a subject assigned to our urban local bodies, so they continue to look up to the state government for solutions. And especially when it's a question of investment in areas like either providing more buses or going in for MRT options, the dependence is still on the state and quite often on the central government. So what is the regime change which is going to happen? And this, I think, is going to be a very critical issue, and that would take one to the other important issue of environmental management. How are cities going to address this issue? We experienced in Delhi some big issues in recent times. That's one part of it. There are any number of cities in our country which have similar problems. There are lakes which generate problems like it's happening in Bangalore. There are issues related to, as I said, the huge increase in traffic. The roads cannot take the number of vehicles which are getting registered or which want to move in the city. The use of personalized vehicles, lack of importance attached to public transport. Even if new initiatives of public transport have been taken, the last mile connectivity issues, there are a whole lot of issues to be addressed, but the fundamental question is if we add more vehicles to the roads, what happens to the congestion and the pollution issues? And I think environmental management is going to be a very, very big factor as far as city governance and management is concerned. And unfortunately, I don't think today's cities are equipped to address this issue. So we'll have to start with monitoring what is the pollution levels, what is the PM levels and things like that, and working out solutions in a compact and integrated manner as far as the city is concerned. It's not enough to blame X or Y as far as these issues are concerned. How would the city governance systems rise to the occasion and find solutions to this and incorporate in the living mechanisms of the cities? Probably electric vehicles will come to hold sway in the next 5-10 years. What is the cost economics of it, and how well are we prepared for that? And that would also get linked to issues like the issues relating to coal-based power generation and things like that. How do we move away from that, and what importance would get attached to the renewable sources, how best that would be able to perform, and how would that meet the requirements of the cities? The other point, of course, is the regional approach, as I mentioned, for better economic activity and working better as far as the areas are concerned. In that, how do states come in? Because states will have to play a key role. It cannot just be left to cities to come together and work out. So what is the mechanism we are going to have in position as far as the constitutional arrangement is concerned? How are states going to facilitate this process? That would also become critical. And megacity governance is going to be another big issue, because we do not have mechanisms of addressing all the issues related to such big cities in a compact and integrated manner. There are any number of institutions, many of them working on a standalone basis. So how do we bring about something like, again, I quote the example of Greater London, where the Greater London mayor seems to be in charge of most of the things relating to city governance. Will we move to a system like that? Because that would be required. Gone would be the days when isolated approaches could be made and X or Y body can claim that I have done my job. Urban planning, as I said, I think the present Minister for Urban Affairs recently stated that urban planning is still in the bullock cart age as far as India is concerned. It's one thing to have master plans and things like that structured, but it is another to look at the issues of the city as a whole and try to work out solutions for the future through this process of master planning. Today what is happening is it's again a sort of a specialized mechanism. It comes for some discussions, debates, and it is given shape to. A good part of it is not respected. There are more violations than people going according to the provisions. So there is something lacking as far as the entire mechanism of city planning is concerned in the form of master plans that would need to undergo a substantial change. And there again, I think one of the SDGs would become very critical for our cities. One other key point which I think would be of great relevance would be, rather than just do things in a haphazard or isolated manner, will we be in a position to focus on livability in cities? Something which has slowly started gaining momentum as far as our cities are concerned. Recently, the Ministry of Urban Affairs has talked about developing livability standards in cities, and an exercise has been initiated. And the items which would come under that gives us an idea as to what is the complexity of the issue which we have to handle as far as city governance is concerned. It talks about governance, identity and culture, education, health, safety, employment, housing and inclusiveness, public open spaces, mixed land use, power supply, transportation and mobility, assured water supply, wastewater management, solid waste management, and reduced pollution. So there is a huge agenda as far as the action for cities is concerned. Will our cities be able to rise up to this requirement? Will there be mechanisms? Mr. Das is sitting here repeatedly before the finance commissions. This issue has come up. What about strengthening municipal cadres, having a new look at what needs to be done as far as city governance is concerned? Whether state finance commissions have been able to look at this issue and make recommendations, whether states have been able to take a call on this. Unfortunately, some of these subjects continue to be items for discussion over and over again and again. So we will have to move out of that if we have to have good, livable, sustainable cities come 2030. So what would be our preparedness for that? And what would be the mechanism which we would introduce? I think that's a big subject, and that is something where huge initiatives need to be taken. We cannot continue with the present approach of let things happen. If resources are not available, let's make do with what is possible. That's where I re-emphasize the point. On the one hand, the mechanisms will have to be strengthened. At the same time, cities will have to look in terms of generating more resources required rather than just look up to other sources as to how best this can be facilitated. So that is going to be critical. So if you are looking at what urban India is going to be by 2030, I see a whole lot of challenges, problems. The question is how best we can address. I'm glad SKOCH initiated this discussion, because this is the time to look at, to take stock of what is it going to be. Once we take stock, or along with that process, we'll have to think in terms of how best to address these issues. And it's not that all this would be stated in the year 2017 or 18. It will have to be a dynamic process, because as again mentioned now, the digitalization process and all the changes which are coming about, that changes the way people would live in our cities. Virtual offices, staggered timings, all these things would become effective as far as our cities are concerned. And how best do we cope with these change requirements, and how best can we meet these challenges? For that, would the city governance systems be empowered? Would they be so structured that they'll be able to take up these and address them better rather than just leave it to state governments? I think these are going to be big issues as far as urban India in 2030 is concerned. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ramachandran, for giving us an opportunity to start thinking in terms of how our city is going to be and the kind of challenges that we are going to face, and what emerging technologies and solutions that are required to put our cities in order so that we really do achieve all the targeted objectives by India 2030. Thank you very much. Now I have the pleasure of inviting Professor Ashima Goyal to talk about monetary policy and fiscal framework, the route to India 2030. Please.
Thank you, Gulshan, and distinguished panelists, co-chair, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to begin by thanking Samir Kocher and the SKOCH Foundation for creating this platform for discussion on issues, policy issues, development issues at all levels, a frank, open discussion. So as we are poised to look at India becoming a $10 trillion economy in 2030, it would need a real rate of growth of 7% per annum. And if we grow at 9%, then we would get 4 trillion more of GDP. Per capita incomes would rise so that India would be classified as a higher middle income, upper middle income group. And typically in such a group, the volatility of growth is reduced. What we have seen over the past 2 decades is much higher growth, but very volatile growth. There are periods of high growth and periods when it has gone down. So strong macroeconomic fundamentals are which imply low inflation and deficits, reduce risk and volatility. They also enable counter-cyclical macroeconomic policy, which is very important for achieving stable growth. The monetary and fiscal framework that we have built as part of our reforms incorporates rules. And what is interesting is that it reverses the relationship between monetary and fiscal policies. Earlier, before, in the period before reforms, and worldwide also, before these rules were put in place in many countries, you tended to have monetary accommodation of fiscal deficits and government spending. And we moved from that to independence, more independence of central banks and restraints on deficits. These rules put in a long-term view that sensitizes everyone to the consequences of short-run action. But as with all changes, the change is sometimes too extreme. You switch from one extreme to the other. And I'm going to argue that it can lead to suboptimal outcomes for a number of reasons. And this is especially so if it suppresses growth below potential, especially for India when we are on a sort of higher catch-up growth path and its poor have an opportunity for a better life. The theoretical literature classifies macroeconomic policies into active or passive. Long-term government borrowings affect debt, while monetary policy affects the cost of government borrowing. Fiscal policy is said to be passive in the literature when it adjusts taxes and expenditure to keep debt within sustainable limits. Active monetary policy responds more than 1-to-1 to any rise in inflation, so that real rates of interest remain positive. This is a switch from the earlier regime where we had active fiscal policy and passive monetary accommodation, typically through the inflation tax. Higher inflation is a form of tax on the public. And if monetary policy is active, the other must passively accommodate it in order to prevent instability. And the reverse also. Only one policy can be active, the other has to be passive. Determinate prices or low inflation also requires one of the policies to be passive. Why has this change happened? One reason is that the world is getting more closely integrated with freer cross-border flows. These impose a restraint on government expenditure. They want to see conservative, low debt because that creates potential risk. And moreover, in an open economy, fiscal stimulus from government expenditure leaks abroad. It tends to appreciate the real exchange through higher inflation. While monetary stimulus depreciates the exchange rate, and interest elasticity of consumption demand tends to rise in a liberalized economy. So India has moved to a monetary fiscal framework where we have FIT and FRBM. That is flexible inflation targeting for monetary policy and Fiscal Responsibility and Debt Management Act. Flexible inflation forecast targeting, which we have adopted, actually does not look just at inflation. It uses multiple indicators, all the macroeconomic variables that affect inflation. But you move from we used to have a multiple indicator regime, an omnibus list. You move to a focus on inflation as your communication vehicle. But a lot of flexibilities are built in, a range of information is used. And the framework of India's FIT is, there's a memorandum of understanding between the central bank and the government. There's a monetary policy committee. There's a band for inflation, and if in 3 quarters inflation exceeds or falls below, that is also important, falls below the band, then the RBI has to give an explanation. There's also a question of which inflation are you targeting, because there are a number of measures of inflation. So what was selected was headline inflation, and you're supposed to tighten only, especially if you're using headline inflation as your indicator, you have to tighten only if there are second round effects, because headline inflation includes commodity, oil or food, which the central bank can only affect inflation which is created by excess demand. So flexible inflation targeting becomes very important if headline inflation is your indicator. You need to accommodate supply shocks, and since you have time, and communication is very important. You want to anchor inflation expectations. So you have to communicate how these supply shocks are expected to play out. Then accommodating them need not create higher inflation or lower inflation expectations. The FRBM Act on the fiscal side was enacted by Parliament in 2003, and it is also forward-looking. There are a whole lot of documents that have to be provided, a medium-term fiscal policy, strategy and macroeconomics framework. And if targets are not met, there has to be a pro rata cut on all expenditures. Some problems with this are that capital expenditure is not protected, no escape clauses, no counter-cyclicality built in, for example, through expenditure caps. There are no incentives for compliance, such as a shift from cash to accrual-based accounts. And the problem is that the government can legislate itself out of commitments. After the global financial crisis in 2008, there was a 4% rise in fiscal deficits. So a new review committee had been set up for this, and the report was submitted in 2016. They have focused on a path of debt reduction and have suggested a fiscal council should be set up. The report is yet to be accepted. The problem is that fiscal and monetary authorities have different objectives, and therefore a lack of coordination is possible. And I'm going to argue that the economic structure, India's economic structure, has implications for optimal coordination. What is this economic structure? We are in a position of labor transition where structural unemployment, large population in agriculture and low productive employment becomes involuntary, because you have what I call quality cycles. Labor is migrating and moving towards different kinds of jobs. So you tend to have a low slope of aggregate supply. That is, output can increase without creating inflation. But there are all kinds of inefficiencies and hidden transaction costs that push up this aggregate supply. And this is the sense in which Indian output is supply constrained. And this is different from saying that there's a vertical full potential output, and when you hit it, then you hit a supply bottleneck. Output is demand determined, but if there is higher inflation, it means costs are rising and you need to constrain production. Shocks on the supply side accounts for a major part of inflation. There is a lot of evidence that the economic structure is such. In the recent period, macroeconomic tightening in 2008, in 2011 and 2013, you had inflation that remained high and sticky while growth fell in the following quarter. Since 2011, we're having an industrial slowdown where there's excess capacity in industry. Econometric estimations give the slope of aggregate supply as 0.13. So reducing demand to control inflation is weak and counterproductive, and there's a high output sacrifice. More productive is to focus on cost push channels, reducing cost and reducing inflation expectations. Now, the objective of the fiscal authority typically is to raise short-run growth and employment. But the irony is that it is more effective in reducing inflation. As we said, in an open economy, fiscal demand stimulus leaks abroad. But a lot of these supply-side bottlenecks can be relieved by fiscal action. The monetary policy objective is low inflation. But the irony is that their instrument, the interest rate, has a greater effect on demand-led growth. And when an emerging economy is on a high growth catch-up path, typically the growth rate is greater than the real interest rate. So even if you're thinking like the new committee, FRBM committee, the objective is to reduce debt, then higher growth is the most effective way to reduce debt. But the FRBM committee has assumed that the real rate of interest will be greater than the growth. And so they have asked for sharp reductions in deficits along the path. But this is not true. Even in the recent low growth and high interest rate periods, always the growth rate in India has been higher than the real rate of interest. And given our demography and expected high rate of growth, it's not going to be true for another 10, 15 years possibly. So to adopt that as your criterion when it's not true and not going to be true for a large number of years, and to hurt the possibilities of high transitional rate of growth is not very good policy. There is a need to maintain high growth for employment and for poverty reduction. So if this is the economic structure, then what is the optimal coordination between monetary and fiscal policies? This needs to work together to shift down this aggregate supply, that is, reduce costs through the economy. It involves supply-side reforms such as improving governance, reducing congestion in cities, improving functioning of land and labor markets. It also has implications for the composition of government expenditure, reduce distorting subsidies, improve infrastructure, and public delivery of public services. Given the global economy, where after the GFC nations are trying to increase exports and the WTO is in problems, the focus to stimulate, and that government expenditure leaks abroad through imports, the focus of government expenditure should be on non-tradables, because most of that demand would stay in the economy. And what are non-tradables? Infrastructure. So the government should focus on spending in infrastructure. What are the implications for monetary policy? Tightening should be mild. The communication must be very good to anchor wage price expectations. The exchange rate should be competitive, but there should not be too much depreciation because it would be inflationary. If there is evidence of productivity and supply-side cost improvements, monetary policy must be accommodative. Use whatever space there is during macroeconomic stabilization to stimulate output and growth. What is the history of the monetary and policy interaction in India? Pre-independence, the Reserve Bank was set up as a strong institution free of political influence. But that was the period of planning. And so precedents and procedures got established that reduced the autonomy of the Reserve Bank. For example, the Reserve Bank agreed to the government's January 1955 proposal for ad hoc treasury bills to help to meet financing shortfalls. And as the manager of government debt, it sought to support the government borrowing program. But Indian central bankers were always, and the Indian political establishment was highly anti-inflation because it was very unpopular politically, where incomes are not indexed. So the Reserve Bank sought additional powers in the 50s over bank cash reserves for the statutory liquidity ratio. All this took away a lot of bank resources to finance government expenditure, but kept money supply growth low. So it squeezed the private sector in order to finance plans where the spending was often very unproductive and gave very low returns. The additional problem was that in the 70s you had large oil shocks, and these new instruments allowed a squeeze on money and credit in response to these supply shocks. So demand-led recession followed. User charges were not raised for many public services after these cost shocks. There was a fall in quality. Public borrowing began for consumption. The ability to fund much needed infrastructure was reduced. Liberalizing reforms in the 90s wanted to switch from this combination which was not working. It strengthened the autonomy of the Reserve Bank. Issues of government securities no longer devolved on the Reserve Bank. Now both monetary and fiscal policy were active, which created instability and harmed growth. Monetary tightening to compensate for there was monetary tightening to compensate for fiscal giveaways. In 2011, large transfers financed by high fiscal deficit raised demand for food where there were marketing bottlenecks and reduced industrial growth. There was also fear of rating agencies by this time because India had opened to a large amount of foreign inflows. And this led to a fiscal consolidation from 2011 because India had high twin deficits and macroeconomic vulnerabilities, fiscal as well as current account deficits. And in 2014, the new government was committed to reducing fiscal deficits. So we are seeing improvements in this period. Macroeconomic vulnerabilities have been reduced, but there is some overreaction. If you focus only on structural reforms in the long run, in the short run you bear a large and irreversible output sacrifice. Growth has been 2% lower since 2011. This implies a $400 per capita loss. So the problem in this structure is that each authority is more effective in achieving the other's objectives. In economics, we call it the prisoner's dilemma, which results in sort of non-cooperative strategic action, where each is afraid the other is not going to do what is needed to meet its objective, and so it doesn't do what it could do to meet the other's objective. The RBI thinks that inflation is a very low priority to the government, so we have to be strict and enforce a demand squeeze to keep inflation low. And the government would think that the Reserve Bank is going to be strict, so we have to find ways to spend more. So whoever plays a non-cooperative strategic sort of action when gets a higher immediate payoff, so both will do it, and the result is both are not cooperating and everyone is worse off. That is the trick in prisoner's dilemmas. You do what you think will maximize your returns, but you're not cooperating with the other, then you're both going to be worse off in the long run. So I have a paper in which I show theoretically that delegation, apart from rules, you can also have delegation to a top governor or the finance minister. So delegation to a more conservative fiscal authority and less conservative macroeconomic or monetary authority can change the prisoner's dilemma to a coordination game where you both cooperate and you get higher payoffs for both, which become self-enforcing. In the jargon, the equilibrium is subgame perfect. A rule such as an FRBM preventing fiscal populism is an alternative, but a simple rule, the problem with a simple rule, if it's strict inflation targeting or FRBM, doesn't work. What you need is constrained discretion because you need some sort of flexibilities. And as I've said earlier, actually inflation targeting, the rhetoric disguises the reality. It actually has considerable flexibility. It's rule-like only in enforcing forward-looking behavior and transparency, and it prevents the central bank from taking actions that have undesirable long-run consequences. And there's supposed to be discussion to educate the public about these long-term effects. But if it is implemented by a conservative central banker, what you're going to get is no flexibility and strict inflation targeting. So the need for a more conservative fiscal authority and less conservative monetary authority to correctly implement the discretion available. There's a quotation, I'm not getting it correctly, it goes something like, the young only understand rules, while the old understand the need for discretion and flexibility. In behavioral economics also, this year the Economics Nobel was given for, when you understand how psychology affects policy and outcomes. So just after the financial crisis, we had excessive macro stimulus and overheating, 4% fiscal deficit, interest rates were cut some 6%. And the economy responded, growth shot up from 6.7 to 9, 10%. And people say that these policies don't work, but they worked, they were too strong and they worked too strongly. So there was a pendulum, a reaction. We can't have this kind of overheating. So the swing was to too much conservatism. And as we've seen that the changes in rules and the role of foreign investors really increases the autonomy of the central bank. But ultimately the central bank is an agency, is an agent for all of us as voters. We are the principals. And therefore the government, which reflects the mandate of the people, has to be dominant. So if the central bank overuses its autonomy, that autonomy has to be reduced. It has to be made more accountable to Parliament. And if a fiscal authority is too conservative, doesn't understand the discretion available for counter-cyclical use of government expenditure, then there would be adverse movements in growth and in revenue, and it is likely to harm electoral prospects. So I'd like to conclude by saying that rules should be used intelligently and work with the strengths of a democracy, mitigate its weakness. For example, inflation targeting can be less strict in India because there is inflation aversion anyway built in. Inflation targeting was introduced in the West because it was thought that agencies have a tendency towards inflation bias in order to win elections. But in India, it doesn't win elections. And especially since the economic structure is such that each acts more effectively on the other's objective, coordination is very important. More populism can raise costs and reduce growth. Imposition of too strict rules can lower potential growth and lead to a delay in elimination of poverty. So balance, flexibility, understanding of context, and constrained discretion intelligently implemented is required. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, as the global center of trade steadily shifts from the west to the east, I believe the theme of discussion for this afternoon and the next 13 years is going to be transition. We first had the benefit of listening to Mr. Shaktikanta Das, who spoke about the evolving role of multilateralism in a world where nationalistic considerations are playing an increasing role, as we're seeing in the developed economies of the world. He also talked about the role of evolution of international organizations such as the World Bank and the IMF, and how governance reforms are needed, not just in a country like India, but also there. We then had the benefit of listening to Dr. M. Ramachandran, who told us about how as economies evolve and there is migration from rural to urban areas, urban agglomerations will play even more increasingly important roles due to the share of GDP and tax collection which arises from them, and how governance systems must evolve to be able to deliver urban governance better. We then had the privilege of listening to Professor Ashima Goyal, who gave us a very educative insight to how demand and supply side issues pertain to inflation targeting, and how supply side reforms are required in governance, infrastructure, and public service delivery to be able to deliver macroeconomic controls in an economy. But as the economy evolves and as the world evolves, so must society, and so must political systems and democratic institutions which govern these systems. Lord Meghnad Desai's latest book, The Raisina Model, which will be released in a few days, talks about a comparative study of political systems between the UK and India. And it is in this spirit of evolution of society that I now invite him to deliver his Hind Keynote on political economy requisites for a new India, India 2030, ladies and gentlemen. Will you please have a big round of applause?
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak at the SKOCH conference. There's a distinguished panel from whom you have, most of whom you have heard already, and of course you've been a very patient and good audience. Now, I think you have heard most of what can be said on the subject. And especially Professor Ashima Goyal's lecture was very good, sobering dose of how difficult it is to do economic policy. And therefore one should not just take it for granted that somehow you can write your ticket and do whatever you like. I'm going to start off with a quotation from Jawaharlal Nehru. As he was writing in the Ahmednagar Fort prison in the 1940s, he of course by that time was aware that he might be the next Prime Minister of India. So he wrote something like this about the economic policy that a National Planning Committee of the Indian National Congress had shaped. He says, the aim was declared to ensure, to be able to ensure an adequate standard of living for the masses. In other words, to get rid of appalling poverty of the people. The irreducible minimum in terms of money had been estimated by economists at figures ranging from 15 rupees to 25 rupees per capita per month. We calculated that a really progressive standard of living would necessitate the increase of national wealth by 500 to 600%. That was, however, too big a jump for us, and we aimed at a 200 to 300% increase within 10 years. We've been here before. Now, the theme of the conference is, can we get to $10 trillion by 2030? So let's do a very simple political arithmetic, a simple calculation. We're already out of 2017. So there are 13 years. The GDP right now is about $2.5 trillion. So you want to quadruple your GDP within 13 years. Now there's a very simple mechanical way of finding out what that requires. The mechanical way of is basically you want to double and then double again the GDP. And the rule roughly is that if you want to double something in 7 years, you have to grow at 10%. So if you want to quadruple your income in 13 years, Indian economy will need to grow at 10% per year in real terms. Now, I think, let's face it, it's like what Jawaharlal Nehru was hoping for, a 200 to 300% increase in income in 10 years. It's not possible. Sorry to break this news to you at the end of the conference. I don't think we'll get to 10 trillion by 2030. There actually is no way of doing it. Interestingly enough, when Nehru finally formed the Planning Commission, one of the younger economists employed by him was K.N. Raj, who had just come from London School of Economics, having done his master's degree there. And K.N. Raj said to Nehru, you know, these growth rates are not possible. You can't just double income in 10 years. You know, it's too high. Maybe you'll grow by 5%. And Nehru said, young man, you have been educated in the Western universities and you are a pessimist. You don't realize what national will can do. Well, you know, fair enough. Raj was right. Nehru actually achieved in the first 2 5-year plans nearly a 5% increase per annum in real GDP. And the Indian economy did not achieve that rate for the next 20 years after his death. And it's only when Rajiv Gandhi was Prime Minister that we managed better than 5% of income. So Indian economy has very few episodes of 10 years of constant growth rate at a respectable rate of, let us say, 7%. The one period, 1998 to 2008, was a very exceptionally good period for the Indian economy, partly because we had the fruits of reform initiated by Manmohan Singh were coming through, and partly because the global economy was booming at that time. But otherwise, Indian economy has by and large not achieved growth rate at a constant rate. So what we're really actually looking at is, if we are very optimistic and suspend all knowledge of history, if the economy were to grow at 7% per annum, which it has sort of off and on done, but 7 for 10 years, we could double income in 10 years, and then we could double income again in another 10 years. So by 2047, I have calculated in this book, which was just mentioned, but by 2047, on the 100th year of Indian independence, we could be at 20 trillion. So if we stretch the horizon, maybe we may be possible. Now, the question really is, why is the Indian economy not capable of constant high growth rates? This is basically the political economy question. Because in terms of Asia, India is an exception, because the Asian miracle stories for Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and of course China itself, has been a story of constant achievement of high growth rate for a period of 10, 20, 30 years. Is capable of doing other Asian economies have been capable of doing that, and it's somewhat independent of the political system, because it has been done from democracies to dictatorships. So if you say Japan, South Korea, China, Singapore, Hong Kong, there's a variety of political systems there. And I think one really ought to ask, what is it in India that prevents this? And I think J. Panda actually mentioned this somewhat, that basically growth is not a top priority of Indian politics. They really are much more interested in qualifying or supplementing growth by other considerations such as redistribution or subsidies or entitlements and so on. And throughout our history, there has been a premature hurry to set up a Western-type welfare state before the income of the country was high enough to be able to afford it. Because the democratic compulsions on the Indian government are very, very strong. It's the only country, as we mentioned before, the only country in modern history which became a democracy while being underdeveloped. And it has been a very successful democracy. And as a very successful democracy, it has had to accommodate extremely strong pressures on the politicians to say, come on, growth is not just, you just can't go pursue growth. You've got to do various other things. And these various other things are basically consumption subsidies to the poor or the farmers or whatever it is, great reluctance to have seriously progressive income taxes and so on. And so there is a reluctance to raise resources by taxation, but there is a great compulsion to spend money on non-productive activities. But I should say on consumption activities rather than investment activities. And so every politician, to a man or a woman, is very eager to cancel farmers' debts or increase the poverty level above whatever it was previously, or increase the rate of Manrega. Because somehow there's a compulsion that the task of the government is to go and give money to people who are deserving people. Of course, the non-deserving people are very clever, so they refuse to pay the tax, which should finance these payments. So we have a continual tension on the fiscal side. Now, so the context of political economy in India is that it is not fully committed to a constant growth policy which would achieve a certain target in a particular time horizon in itself. Now, why is that? Now, first of all, one has to remember that the biggest influence on Indian politics was a man who was actually totally opposed to growth and modernization, and that's Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi was totally opposed to modernization and didn't like growth at all. His idea basically was that poverty need not be cured, poverty should be shared. I mean, his ideal world of what he wanted to do, dismantle the Congress party, have village republics and so on, have charkha. Great thing, have high thinking, plain living, high thinking. The whole strategy is growth is not necessary, might even be quite corrupting. Therefore, we really ought to have share poverty. And that is an extremely strong influence in Indian politics. Second influence is a great suspicion of profit and private business. I would more or less say that in Indian political system, there is only a single economic philosophy. It's sort of a khichdi. Everybody has great faith in the ability of government to cure all problems. Everybody is very hostile to private business and the profit system. They don't like markets, and by and large they believe that foreign capital is shouldn't be openly welcome, but I guess, it'll do if it's under control. So India has no free market philosophy, no party with free market philosophy, nor a party with a seriously statist socialist policy. It's a mixture of this and that and the other thing. And therefore, there is no serious economic debate in Indian politics about rival models of how to achieve growth. The consequence then is that if you want to reform the system, you can't just have one party with a majority in Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha just marching the economy forward. All reform has to be consensual. Every political reform India has had since 1991. I should say parenthetically that I think we wasted 40 years after independence in a very low growth strategy, but I won't go into that. But since 1991, at least for the last 25 or 26 years, we have had growth. It has always been a result of consensual reform. And if you want to create reform by consensus, it takes a long time. Just look at the GST. How long it took India to create the goods and services tax. The debates has been going on, the formal meetings have been. Now 15 to 20 years it has taken to create a goods and services tax. And all that the goods and services tax really does is make India a single market. It has taken 70 years since independence to unite India into a single market. I mean, it is a complete scandal. The European Union, which is more or less a similar size, and it has 28 nations in it, took only 40 years to make itself into a single market. And India has taken 70 years to construct a single market. Even after GST was constructed, the complaints that we heard from all political parties were, okay, they're partly hypocritical, but you could not believe that all these parties had taken part in the discussion of construction of GST. So the political economy of India is actually quite hostile to rapid and constant growth. It doesn't matter because ultimately the people are willing to pay the price. No party has been voted out of office for failing to kind of, achieve constant high growth rate. And no party has ever been elected on the promise that forget about all these transfers and subsidies, we're just going to go and invest and invest and invest and achieve double-digit growth rate within, over the next 15 years. So India is very, it has chosen for itself a medium and non-constant growth strategy because the political pressures of democratic governance are such that governments always choose to take the softer option in rather than really lay the law down. I'll just give one example and then it'll sort of illustrate the thing and then I'll stop. Take the problem of distress among the farmers. Right? We have a distress among farmers almost as a constant theme in politics. Every year, some state or other has farmers' problems. And the response usually is that farmers are indebted, they are in great distress, and there is no doubt that they are in great distress, and therefore we should write the farmers' debts off. Apart from the fact that it creates what's called the problem of moral hazard, that you're actually encouraging people to get into debt again because they know they will never have to pay the debt back, so why should they care? The system has never asked why is it that there is farmers' distress? And there's farmers' distress because in other countries, China for instance, or almost every country which has come from backwardness to development, the economic strategy was to industrialize very rapidly, transfer people from the rural areas to urban areas because it was always thought the rural areas had surplus labor. You could reduce the supply of labor in rural areas without any effect on productivity and take these people and give them better full-time jobs in the urban areas. Yes, the first generation may have to live in slums, but the second generation is going to benefit. This has been a constant, most successful model of development. It was pioneered by a man called Arthur Lewis, a West Indian economist. He got the Nobel Prize for it, and that's more or less. China has now reached what's called this Lewis moment. There's no longer surplus labor left in rural China. And so China will now have to have a different kind of strategy for growth than it has had so far. What did India do? In the first 30 years, the ambition of becoming a Soviet Union type economy, India created an industrial structure which was so capital intensive that it did not absorb any rural labor at all. It did not even absorb urban labor. All planning for the first 40 years or so did not create any jobs. The jobs which were created were by and large for skilled, educated people. So we have a very small formal sector and a large informal sector. And worse than that, 80% of Indian agriculture is of subsistence farmers. 80% of agriculture is of people who have very precarious living. And the whole system has at no stage faced up to the problem that the tragedy of Indian agriculture is not something to be sentimental about. The tragedy of Indian agriculture is an indictment of the political leadership which has neglected industrialization and created the structure. And of course you've heard about labor market reform, land market reform, and so on. So all these things combined. Now, there's absolutely no chance over the next 20 years that anybody is going to solve any of these problems. So I think India does grow. As Guru Charan Das says, India grows at night. There will be growth. There will be growth roughly of 7 to 8%, maybe between 5 to 8% off and on over the next few years. Yes, India will get richer, but I don't think it's going to be a straight upward journey, non-stop from here to there. That's not the way the country is, that's not the way the politics is, and that's not the way anybody will get elected if you promise that. So cheer up, we are like this only, and therefore we will stay like this only. But in the meantime, we have achieved which no other Asian or African or Latin American country has ever achieved. It's one of the deepest and richest political democracy the world has ever seen. And that is the success of India. High growth rate or high income is not. We'll live, don't worry. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, since the invention of the wheel, there has been no looking back for mankind. And as much as we may romanticize the idea of artificial intelligence changing our life, of blockchain and Bitcoin revolutionizing the way we transact, these technologies are here to stay. And we're living in what is now the fourth industrial revolution. How apt is it then that the term, which was coined at the World Economic Forum, is being explained to us in a digital path to India 2030, is being put forth by Mr. Pranjal Sharma, who has just recently written a book called Kranti Nation, India and the Fourth Industrial Revolution, in which he uses a bottom-up approach to explain how profiles and organizations and institutions are using transformative and disruptive technologies to be able to deliver better and evolve the Indian economy. May I now invite Mr. Pranjal Sharma to deliver his Jai Hind keynote on a digital path to India 2030, please. A huge round of applause, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you so much, eminent panelist. I have a great task of speaking after some of the best speakers and knowledgeable experts, and I'm also standing between lunch and all of you. So let me quickly ask all of you, how many of you are using mobile phones today? How many of you are using internet through the mobile phone? So India is the country where the most number of people in the world use the mobile phone to access internet. So this is a very huge digital revolution. Couple of figures I want to share with you. 1 minute में क्या होता है? 1 minute में आपको मालूम है दुनिया भर में कितनी मेल्स भेजी जाती हैं? 1 minute में सिर्फ. Anybody wants to take a guess? 156 million mails are sent every minute. Every minute, 4.1 million videos are watched on YouTube alone. 4.1 million videos. Every minute, 3.6 million Google searches happen. This is across the world. ये सिर्फ 2017 में है, and this is the end of 2017. So think about it कि आप लोग यहाँ जब बैठे होंगे, हम लोग बात कर रहे थे, उस समय आप लोगों ने कितनी गूगल सर्च की होंगी, हम लोगों का नाम देखा होगा, ये देखा होगा इन लोगों ने क्या काम किया है, कहाँ बोला है, कितनी किताब लिखी हैं, और ये क्यों आए हैं हमको बोर करने के लिए. लेकिन ये है डिजिटल रेवोल्यूशन. मिस्टर दास ने इंडस्ट्रियल रेवोल्यूशन की बात की, एंड रोहन ऑल्सो टॉक्ड अबाउट इट. सो डू यू नो व्हाट आर द 4 इंडस्ट्रियल रेवोल्यूशंस? एंड आई एम श्योर अ लॉट ऑफ यू नो, बट the first industrial revolution happened when steam, bhap, was harnessed, and with that we started using machines. Humans started using machines with steam. So steam engine was created, and then a lot of other machines were created. A few hundred years later, we decided and discovered, that is, humans discovered that electricity can be harnessed. So बिजली से सब कुछ काम होने लगा. उसकी वजह से we had factories which had mass production, and you saw the kind of automobile manufacturing, all kinds of machines being created in big factories. That took lesser time, 100 years maybe. Then in the 60s, we had the third industrial revolution. वो क्या था? When a computer was invented, it was finalized, it was finessed, and from a large computer which would fill a room like this, to a computer sitting on your table, to a laptop, and finally this is a computer. A mobile is a computer with as much computing power that one of the biggest computers had maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago. Fourth industrial revolution kya hai? So it's digital plus, and my submission to you, Rohan, and to Samir, is that it's a digital plus path, because digital economy is about humans interacting and contacting each other with the help of internet. The fourth industrial revolution is much bigger, where there are new types of technologies which were referred to: blockchain, Internet of Things, digital printing, neuroscience, machine learning, artificial intelligence. All of them together are called fourth industrial revolution, and which is what we are living in right now. आप सबके हाथ में जो मोबाइल है, it is using artificial intelligence. आपको मालूम है, when you send a mail, how many of you are using Gmail on your phone? So when you receive a mail, उसके नीचे लिखा आता है yes, no, maybe, I will attend, I will not attend, I agree. That is an artificial intelligence algorithm which is reading your mail and deciding what your response should be and could be. You can choose, or you could choose not to. So imagine these 156 million mails are being read by an algorithm. So that is the fascinating part of artificial intelligence. The fundamental difference between the digital revolution and the new revolution is that machines are talking to each other. Earlier, I would use a computer to talk to another person and connect with another person. Today, two computers can talk to each other, two devices can talk to each other, and humans are not involved. So it doesn't matter whether you want it or not, but your fridge and your phone can talk. They are connected. So Internet of Things, which is a very important platform like artificial intelligence, means that every single product that you can think of, the seat that you are sitting on, the tripod stand, the lights, everything will be connected and is already connected to the internet in many places. That means each of these products has a sensor which is connected to the internet. So we are thinking of 50 billion, 20 billion, maybe 100 billion devices will be connected to the internet. So what does it mean for us? So there's going to be a lot of automation. What does it mean for India? Automation, more robots, jobs are going to be lost. So the question there is, are we prepared? And I think that is a key question, that this is inevitable. ये हो रहा है, इसको आप रोक नहीं सकते, लेकिन क्या हम इसके लिए तैयार हैं और इसके लिए क्या तैयारी करनी पड़ेगी? ये तैयारी हमको इंडिविजुअल लेवल पे करनी पड़ेगी और इंस्टीट्यूशनल लेवल पे करनी पड़ेगी. And unfortunately, I would say that India is not prepared. So while the corporate world, the industrial world has moved ahead pretty rapidly, and my book is really about examples of companies which are already using 3D printing in India, already using deep machine learning in India, they're already using IoT platforms for manufacturing in India. So it has started, it's happened, but we just don't realize it. And I think that realization is very important if you want to prepare for it. Why are we not prepared? Because there's a university in Switzerland called IMD. It did a talent ranking, and some of my colleagues at the panel might be interested to know that India's rank for talent, so I'm not talking about employability, but India's rank in talent across the world out of 64 countries is 51. We are amongst the lowest talented people in terms of the work that is required, because in future it won't be just jobs, it will be work. If you see all around us, people will do part-time work, Uber drivers, Ola drivers, they're all working. They don't have a job, they don't have an employment, but they have a work. A lot of them are, and that's what the Prime Minister is encouraging to create entrepreneurs. We are very low on our education. No Indian university is there in the top 25 Asian list. I'm not talking about the global list. Even in the Asian list, we are not there. We have a higher ranking in our billionaire creation index. So हम लोग करोड़पति ज़्यादा बना रहे हैं, but we are not creating innovators. On the innovators index, we are very low. We really don't spend on research and development. So I think these are the fundamental discordant notes in our economic, social infrastructure that is really holding us back and not allowing us to make the most of this, because the technology will go ahead. It will move on. It will envelop a lot of us, and it will make a lot of us redundant. Yes, universal basic income, which Mr. Panda talked about, is important, but do we want to put maybe more than half the society on UBI? Why don't we work towards creating a more productive workplace situation? I think the important thing for us to learn over here is how do we prepare, how do we ensure that when technology becomes bigger and bigger, even today, many heads of corporations, many ministers, many policymakers don't realize how deep the change is. All of you who are working at grassroots are already feeling the impact of technology. It can be used for a lot of good things. So artificial intelligence is being used to help in health. So there's one example that an algorithm, a software, can check all the retinal scans. So अगर जिनको भी आँख की बीमारी है, जो आँख का जो स्कैन है, वो एक सॉफ्टवेयर करता है, and it compares your eye with maybe lakhs and lakhs of other examples and gives a better prescription than a doctor can do. And it can do it in the most remote rural villages if we have the right technology in place. That means affordable healthcare can really be enhanced with technology if we put the right systems in place. Similarly, a lot of small young startups have started using new technologies to help farmers get the latest information about weather, about soil, about the right price in the market. बाजार में क्या दाम चल रहा है उनके सामान का, वो उनको तुरंत पता चल जाएगा, जिससे बिचौलियों को उनको उनका शोषण करने का मौका नहीं मिलेगा. So I think I'll close on this note that the fourth industrial revolution, or the digital plus system, society, economy, is already here, and I think that both the corporate world, the policy makers, and all individuals have to now come together to prepare and make sure that we make the most of it. हमको इससे सबसे ज़्यादा फ़ायदा मिले, लेकिन जो उसकी नुकसान है वो हम कम से कम रखें. अगर हम ये कर पाएंगे तो हम बहुत जल्दी आगे बढ़ पाएंगे, बिकॉज ये टेक्नोलॉजी जो है, this technology is bringing India at the same level of possible development as the rest of the world. Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, on that note of transition and change and evolution comes to a close our Jai Hind session, which after 50 conferences is the culmination of 17 years of work and dedication. And I must say, ladies and gentlemen, that it is each and every one of these Jai Hind keynote speakers which have brought about a transformation in our understanding and perhaps society's understanding of how India must look like in 2030. I thank each and every one of them. May we please have a huge round of applause for all our Jai Hind keynote panelists, ladies and gentlemen. May I now please request the panelists for a group photo for the Jai Hind session.
we'll go for